Welcome to our latest video, featuring one of Jordan Peterson's most insightful moments. We've gone the extra mile with some special editing to enhance your viewing experience. And don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more content like this.
To think about life as a problem that is to be solved rationally is insufficient because you're not a rational being, or you're only partly a rational being. You're also an emotional being, and you're a motivated being, and you're an embodied being, and that's a lot different than being purely rational. And I would say there's actually not even debate about that anymore, because it's pretty damn clear that rationality cannot really operate unless it's embodied, so it has a set of operations that it can undertake, that it's motivated so that there's certain things it's doing and other things that it isn't, that it's emotional because emotions are low resolution, quick solutions to problems that can't be computed. So for example, we get in an argument and we just can't go anywhere, and at some point you say, well, to hell with you, I'm going home. You're angry. That's right. Do you win? Well, no, but you don't have to have the stupid argument anymore. So the anger is actually it's a way of popping you out of a rational framework that there's no escaping from. You just say, well, this is stupid, and you leave. It's like there's nothing rational about that except that you don't want to stand there and argue till you starve to death. So you need the emotions to give you guides in situations that you can't really compute your way through. And only inside of that does rationality operate, with all of those underlying predicates. And the rationality has to be informed by the body and by the motivations and by the emotions for it to even operate. So the existentialists are correct about that, to deny rationality as the fundamental principle of orientation. That doesn't mean that irrationality is the right approach. It means that rationality has to be augmented by other elements of being, elements of subjective being. And that's akin to the psychoanalytic viewpoint too, that you have to integrate your drives and emotions, especially anger and sexuality, into your personality, and also akin to Piaget's idea that the sub-personalities, the reflexes and so forth, have to be organized into a playable game so that everything is working in harmony. So it's a similar idea. Now, the existentialists regard the division between object and subject as part of what's specifically torturing people who are outside of, say, traditional systems of belief. Because, and this is a tricky one, scientists might claim that, well, the world is material and matter is essentially dead and without spirit or psyche. And it's easy, as a consequence of adopting that viewpoint, to think the same thing about you, that you're ultimately a short-lived material entity in a meaningless material world. But the weird thing about that, and this is worth thinking about, is that if you're a scientist, you throw away the subjective as soon as you start operating the science. Because the idea is, well, you'll watch something according to a procedure, and you'll watch it, and you'll watch it, and you'll watch it, and we're only going to allow what all of you experience the same way to be real. Well, you throw out the subjective right at the beginning. And then so you can't say, well, there's no subject left in what results. It's the reason there's nothing left in what results is because you threw it out to begin with. Now, the question is, what should you do with it? When the existentialists say, well, you're alive. You can't just dispense with it. The fact that you're alive is the critical issue. And so you can use science as a tool, which is proper, but if you use it as a way of describing being, well, then you fall into this subject-object dichotomy, and underneath that is nihilism or the proclivity for totalitarianism. So they don't like that idea. They don't like the idea of compartmentalization for people either, but we won't go into that to any great degree. Okay, now I'm going to read you some things from some of the people that I described, and we'll take them apart a little bit. Things I've been collecting for a long period of time. So this is Nietzsche, Dostoevsky, and Kierkegaard, and I called them prophets of the dawning age. Kierkegaard, the Danish philosopher and writer, was really the first person who wrote about phenomena like anxiety, dread in more particularly. So he was the first person who sort of conceptualized it as something akin to a scientific phenomena, something that had existence, and he wrote very much about that. Nietzsche, of course, was the great prophet of the death of God, and a prognosticator of what the psychological consequences of the demise of this classic meaning structure that was unbelievably ancient, what the collapse of that actually meant. I mean, you can think about Christianity, and then maybe you could think about the Judaism that it was embedded in as even an older system. But that Judaism emerged out of the Middle East, partly out of Egypt, which was enmeshed in even an older belief system, and that was enmeshed in something absolutely prehistoric. And so it was a continuum in some sense of adaptive structures that reigned supreme essentially right until the scientific revolution. And so we're outside of that now. We're in a different paradigm, and there are consequences to that. And that was the sort of thing that Nietzsche was concentrating on. And he actually in some ways made it worse, because Nietzsche was an incredible critic of Christianity. I mean, he wrote a book called The Antichrist, and all he did in that book brilliantly was take dogmatic Christianity to task. Now, one of the things he did say, which is very interesting, was that Christianity died at its own hand. So his notion was that because Christianity, say Judeo-Christianity, had elevated truth to the highest virtue, that search for truth then ended up undermining the axioms of Christianity itself. So it developed a tool, an unbelievably powerful analytic tool, and then used it to, well, it's like we were sitting on a branch and sawed it off with the saw that we had invented, and then everyone fell. And Dostoevsky was an Orthodox Christian, but also an extraordinarily brilliant man, and he was absolutely terrified at what the consequences of the dissolution of that belief system was going to mean for Russia in particular. And Dostoevsky explored nihilism to great degree in Notes from Underground and in Crime and Punishment, because the murderer in Crime and Punishment is essentially nihilistic. He's a nihilistic narcissist, roughly speaking, and that's what compels him to commit murder. But Dostoevsky also wrote a book called The Devils, which is an amazing book, where he predicted that the sudden death of Christianity in Russia was going to produce the catastrophic totalitarian horrors of the Soviet Union. And he predicted that in like 1880, 1890, which was 30 years before the revolution. Absolutely remarkable. Nietzsche, a genius. Nietzsche was a full professor when that was impossible, I think when he was 24, and that just never happened. And so his extraordinary genius was recognized very early, but he was also extraordinarily ill, sick, physically. His dad died at about 40 of something they called softening of the brain, which was actually a fairly common diagnostic category back then. No one really knows what it was. Some people have suggested that he had syphilis from one sexual encounter, or that it was hereditary, but nobody really knows. But anyways, his father died young, and Nietzsche died very young as well. He was mentally incapacitated for the last few years of his life, and died after that. And so he could only serve as a professor for a while because he couldn't see very well, and he was always sick, and he ended up living in this little village, I believe in Switzerland, where he wrote his books, and he could only write a paragraph or two at a time before he became very ill. And so his writing is extraordinarily condensed and dense and brilliant. And I think he gave away, Beyond Good and Evil, which is his masterpiece, although he had many, I think it only sold 500 copies in his lifetime. So he also believed that he was only writing for himself. He didn't really know if anybody was ever going to pay any attention to what he said, but they certainly did. So I would say he ended up being certainly one of the 10 most influential people of the late 19th and early 20th century. This is an example of his writing. Of what is great, one must either be silent or speak with greatness. With greatness, that means cynically, and with innocence. What I relate is the history of the next 2 centuries. I describe what is coming, what can no longer come differently. The advent of nihilism. Our whole European culture is moving for some time now with a tortured tension that is growing from decade to decade as towards a catastrophe, restlessly, violently, headlong, like a river that wants to reach the end, that no longer reflects, that's afraid to reflect. He that speaks here has conversely done nothing so far but to reflect, as a philosopher and solitary by instinct, who has found his advantage in standing aside, outside. Why has the advent of nihilism become necessary? Sorry about that. Because the values we have had hitherto thus draw their final consequence. Because nihilism represents the ultimate logical conclusion of our great values and ideals. Because we must experience nihilism before we can find out what value those values really had. We require at some time new values. Nihilism stands at the door. Whence comes this uncanniest of all guests? Point of departure. This is a good example of how Nietzsche said he philosophized with a hammer. And it means that he spent hours, days, weeks, months concentrating on how to make a single sentence as packed with significance as he could possibly manage. And so Nietzsche said, it's the best arrogant statement I've ever read. He said, I can say in a sentence what it takes other people a whole book to say. And then he said, what they can't say in a whole book. That's pretty good, eh? It's like, the first one's a real blow to the solar plexus, and the second one is like, I can top that with no problem. Point of departure. It is an error to consider social distress or physiological degeneration or the corruption of all things as the cause of nihilism. That's a critique of the later Freudian ideas right there and then, because what Nietzsche says was, look, if things are going wrong for you, or if they're going wrong in general, it's really straightforward to say that, well, there's something wrong with society, that would be social distress, or there's some physiological degeneration, there's something wrong with you physically, or everything is just corrupted, being itself is corrupt, which is a classic explanation, right? You hear that all the time. You think, well, people are suffering for one reason or another. Well, why? Well, there's something wrong biologically, or society is corrupted and everything is unfair. Nietzsche says, no, you're not going to get away with that. First he says, ours is the most honest and compassionate age, comparing modern civilization, let's say, to everything that has come before it. So speaking of corruption is not something you can do lightly. And then he says, and this is remarkable, distress, whether psychic, physical, or intellectual, need not at all produce nihilism. That is the radical rejection of value, meaning, and desirability. Such distress always permits a variety of interpretations.